Hey everyone, glad to see you again. Let's get started. Imagine holding an ice cube in your hand. At first, it feels solid and reliable. You trust its shape. But slowly it melts, not because you failed, not because you were careless, but because heat and time do not ask for permission. Life works the same way. One day, everything feels stable. Your work, your family, your faith. Then, without warning, the temperature changes. A phone call, a diagnosis, a loss, a silence where answers used to live. This is where the book of Job begins. Not in comfort, not in success, but in the moment when a good man's world collapses without explanation. The book of Job is not a story about suffering alone. It is a story about what happens when belief meets reality. Most books promise solutions. This one offers questions. It challenges the simple idea that good people are always rewarded and bad people are always punished. Job is not reckless, corrupt, or careless with his faith, and yet everything is taken from him. This book does not rush to comfort. It slows you down. It asks you to sit with uncertainty. The book of Job is not about why suffering exists. It is about who we become when suffering refuses to explain itself. This is not theology for scholars. This is truth for anyone who has ever whispered, "I did everything right, so why did this happen?" Chapter 1. The Man Who Had Everything. Job lived in the land of Uz. He was known not for power, but for character, not for ambition, but for integrity. Scripture describes him with rare clarity, blameless, upright, one who feared God and turned away from evil. Job had a large family, great wealth, and deep respect in his community. But what made Job different was not what he owned, it was how lightly he held it. He did not worship his success or assume it was permanent. Whenever his children gathered to celebrate, Job prayed quietly, not out of fear, but humility. His faith was not transactional. He did not believe God owed him anything. He believed gratitude required responsibility. Then the story shifts beyond earth into a conversation Job never hears. A truth emerges that makes us uncomfortable. Life is larger than human awareness. Job becomes the subject of a test, not because he is weak, but because he is strong. Stability begins to fracture. Messengers arrive one by one. His livestock is stolen. His servants are killed. His children die in a sudden disaster. No pause, no mercy between sentences. This is how suffering often comes, not slowly, but all at once. Job grieves. He tears his robe. He falls to the ground, and then he speaks words that echo through history. "Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I shall return. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away." This is not denial. This is acceptance without understanding. The principle is clear and unsettling. Faith is not believing that nothing bad will happen. Faith is believing even when it does. Job does not call it fair. He does not call it good. He simply refuses to pretend he is in control. Ask yourself quietly, if everything I rely on disappears, what remains? Job's strength was not wealth or certainty. It was humility before the unknown. Take a moment today not to fix your life, but to ask what part of your faith depends on comfort. Sometimes life does not test our strength, it tests whether our faith can survive without guarantees. Chapter 2. When the pain becomes personal. Suffering is one thing when it happens around you. It becomes something else entirely when it enters your body. In the first chapter, Job lost what he owned and whom he loved. In the second, he begins to lose what remains most intimate, his own flesh, his own sense of physical safety. This is where pain stops being abstract. This is where endurance is no longer about words, but about breath, posture, and survival. The story again opens beyond Job's awareness. A conversation continues, unseen and unheard by the one who will be most affected by it. This detail matters, because much of human pain is shaped by realities we never witness. Job does not consent to this test. He does not volunteer. His suffering is not a lesson he signed up for, and yet it comes anyway. This alone challenges a dangerous belief many people carry, that suffering must always be deserved or chosen. Sometimes it is neither. This time, the question is sharper. Job has lost everything external, yet his faith remains intact. So the challenge shifts inward. What if pain is no longer distant? What if it settles into the body, the skin, the nerves? What if belief must coexist with constant discomfort? And so, Job is struck with painful sores from head to toe. His body becomes a landscape of agony. Sleep offers no escape. Stillness brings no relief. Pain becomes his companion. Job sits among ashes. This image is not symbolic in a poetic sense. It is physical, humiliating, and raw. Ashes were a place of mourning, a place of exclusion, a place for those who had fallen from dignity into despair. Job scrapes his sores with broken pottery, not because it helps, but because pain demands motion. When pain is intense enough, even meaningless movement feels like control. This is an important moment, because many people imagine faith as something clean and composed. Job's faith is neither. It exists alongside frustration, discomfort, and visible brokenness. Faith does not remove him from the ashes, it meets him there. Then comes one of the most misunderstood figures in the story, Job's wife. Often remembered only for a single line, she looks at Job and says, "Do you still hold fast to your integrity? Curse God and die." These words are usually read as betrayal, but consider them more carefully. This woman has lost her children too. She has lost her security, her future, her sense of order. Now she watches the man she loves dissolve in front of her eyes. Her words are not theology. They are grief speaking without structure. They are pain demanding an end. Job responds, but not with cruelty. He says, "You speak as one of the foolish women would speak. Shall we receive good from God, and shall we not receive evil?" This is not a declaration that suffering is good. It is an admission that life cannot be reduced to comfort alone. Job does not deny the pain. He refuses only the idea that faith exists solely for reward. Here, the chapter introduces one of its deepest principles. Belief that only survives in ease is not belief, it is convenience. Job's integrity is not stubbornness, it is coherence. He will not rewrite reality just to escape discomfort. He allows pain to exist without letting it define his understanding of God. Then 3 friends enter the story. Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar come to visit Job. At first, they do something profoundly wise. They sit with him in silence for 7 days. No speeches, no explanations, no corrections, just presence. This may be the most compassionate moment in the entire book. Before theology, before arguments, before blame, there is silence. Pain is honored by not being rushed. But silence is difficult to maintain. Eventually, the friends begin to speak, and when they do, the tone of the story shifts. Their intention is not cruel. They want to make sense of chaos. They want order restored, and so they reach for a simple framework. Suffering must be earned. If Job is suffering, then Job must have done something wrong. This belief comforts them, because if pain is always deserved, then randomness is not real, and if randomness is not real, then they are safe. This is where the story becomes painfully modern. Humans are uncomfortable with unexplained suffering. We prefer blame over mystery. We prefer simple answers over honest uncertainty.
Job's friends speak with confidence, logic, and tradition, but without empathy. They offer explanations instead of understanding. They defend ideas instead of a person. Chapter 2 closes before the debates begin, but the foundation is laid. Job is alone in his pain, surrounded by people who believe they are helping. His suffering has now taken 3 forms: loss, physical agony, and misunderstanding. This is often how pain deepens, not by intensity alone, but by isolation. The principle of this chapter is subtle but devastating. Pain tests not only faith, but relationships. It reveals who can sit with discomfort and who needs answers more than truth. Job's body is broken, but his clarity remains. He does not pretend to enjoy suffering. He simply refuses to abandon integrity for relief. Pause here and reflect. When someone near you is hurting, do you rush to explain, or do you slow down enough to witness? When you are hurting, do you measure your faith by comfort or by honesty? Job teaches us that endurance is not loud. It does not announce itself. Sometimes it looks like sitting in ashes and choosing not to lie. The call to action in this chapter is quiet. The next time pain enters your life, yours or someone else's, resist the urge to solve it immediately. Breathe, stay present, let silence do its work. Faith does not always need words. Sometimes it needs patience. Chapter 2 closes with no resolution, and that is intentional, because real suffering rarely resolves on schedule. It lingers, it waits, and it asks a question that cannot be rushed. Job has not spoken his pain yet. That comes next. And when it does, the story will grow darker before it grows clearer.
Chapter 3. The Day Silence Breaks. For 7 days, Job did not speak. Not because he had nothing to say, but because pain sometimes presses the voice inward. Silence, at first, was mercy. His friends sat with him, and the weight of suffering rested quietly between them. But silence cannot hold forever. When words finally come, they arrive not as prayers, but as raw truth. Chapter 3 is the moment Job stops enduring quietly and begins to speak honestly. Job opens his mouth, and the first thing he does is not to curse God. He curses the day of his birth. This distinction matters. Job does not reject God. He rejects existence itself. He looks back at the moment he entered the world and wished it had never happened. He calls for the day to be erased, swallowed by darkness, forgotten by time. This is not poetic exaggeration. It is the language of despair stripped of politeness. In ancient thought, birth was a blessing beyond question. To curse the day of one's birth was to challenge one of the deepest assumptions of society. Job's suffering has pushed him beyond social boundaries. Pain has taken him to a place where gratitude feels dishonest. He is not performing faith, he is exposing reality. Job imagines the night he was conceived. He wishes it had been barren, unmarked by joy or announcement. He does not blame his parents. He does not accuse God directly. Instead, he questions the very logic of existence. Why was I allowed to be born if this was the destination? Why give light to someone whose path is hidden, whose future leads only to anguish? These are dangerous questions, not because they are sinful, but because they refuse easy comfort. Job's words force the listener to confront a truth many people hide. Sometimes life itself feels like a burden. This chapter gives language to emotions that are often silenced by shame. It tells us that despair does not make a person faithless, it makes them human. Job then turns his attention to death, not as something to fear, but as something to envy. He imagines the grave as a place of rest, where kings and slaves lie down together, where the weary are at peace. In his suffering, death appears gentler compared to life. This is not a desire for destruction, it is a longing for relief. Job is not seeking to die, he is seeking rest. Here the text confronts a misconception of strength. We often believe strength looks like optimism, resilience, and forward momentum. Job presents a different image. Strength in this moment looks like honesty without hope.
It looks like speaking pain without resolution. It looks like staying alive while wishing you had never been born. The structure of Job's speech is important. He moves from the past to the present, from birth to existence, from existence to meaning. His questions grow heavier. Why is light given to those in misery? Why is life offered to those who cannot find joy? These are not philosophical puzzles. They are cries from someone whose internal world has collapsed. Notice what Job does not say. He does not ask for answers. He does not ask for healing. He does not ask for restoration. He asks why life continues when suffering has made it unbearable. This is grief at its most honest. It does not negotiate. It does not seek reassurance. It simply exposes the wound. This chapter marks a turning point in the book. Until now, Job has been acted upon. Loss came to him. Pain entered his body. Silence surrounded him. Now Job takes agency through speech. His words do not fix anything, but they reclaim his humanity. To speak is to assert existence, even when existence feels like a mistake. There is a deep principle here. Unspoken pain becomes internal violence. When suffering has no language, it turns inward. Job's speech, though dark, is an act of survival. He's choosing expression over implosion. This is not rebellion, it is release. Job's friends listen, but they do not understand yet. They hear his words as accusations. They will soon respond with logic, doctrine, and correction. But before their voices enter the narrative, the book allows Job to speak without interruption. This space matters. It tells us that pain deserves to be heard before it is evaluated. Modern readers often struggle with this chapter. It feels uncomfortable, negative, even hopeless. But that discomfort reveals our bias. We prefer stories where suffering leads quickly to insight. Job refuses that pace. He insists that despair has its own language and that rushing past it is a form of dishonesty. The tone of chapter 3 is not calm, but it is controlled. Job does not scream randomly. His words are structured, deliberate, and poetic. This shows us that despair can be articulate. Pain does not erase intelligence, it sharpens it. Job's clarity cuts deep because it is unfiltered by optimism. Reflect for a moment. Have you ever wished you could erase a chapter of your life? Not fix it, not reframe it, but remove it entirely. Job gives voice to that impulse without glorifying it. He shows us that acknowledging darkness does not mean surrendering to it. The quiet call to action in this chapter is simple but difficult. Allow yourself and others to speak pain without correction. Not every expression of despair needs to be challenged. Some need to be witnessed. When someone says, "I don't want this life anymore," they may not be asking for solutions. They may be asking to be seen. Chapter 3 ends without answers, and that is deliberate. The book does not reward honesty immediately. It respects the process. Job has opened the door to dialogue, but the room is still dark. Understanding will come later, if at all. For now, there is only truth spoken aloud. This chapter teaches us that faith does not require silence. It requires courage. The courage to speak even when words lead nowhere. Job has not abandoned God. He has abandoned pretending. And in doing so, he steps fully into the human experience of suffering, where questions are not signs of weakness, but evidence of engagement. The silence is broken. The debate is about to begin. But before arguments and explanations fill the air, the book leaves us with a raw reminder. Sometimes the most faithful thing a person can do is tell the truth about how much it hurts.
Chapter 4. When comfort turns into accusation. After Job finally breaks his silence, the atmosphere changes. Pain has been spoken aloud, and now it demands a response. The first to speak is Eliphaz the Temanite, the eldest among the friends, and the one who believes wisdom should sound calm, balanced, and respectful. His voice is measured, his words appear gentle, but beneath the softness lies an assumption that will shape everything that follows. Eliphaz begins carefully.
He acknowledges Job's past. He reminds him that Job once strengthened others, that he supported the weak, that his words lifted those who were falling. This opening feels kind, even validating. It establishes Eliphaz as someone who remembers Job not as a failure, but as a guide. Yet this praise is not an end in itself, it is a setup, because what follows quietly turns encouragement into expectation. Eliphaz suggests that now it is Job's turn to accept instruction. He implies that someone who once counseled others should now take his own advice. At first glance, this seems reasonable, but it reveals something subtle and dangerous. Eliphaz believes suffering follows a predictable pattern. If advice worked before, it should work now. If principles applied to others, they must apply to Job in the same way. Then comes the central claim of Eliphaz's speech: innocent people do not suffer. According to his worldview, those who plow evil reap trouble, and those who sow suffering harvest pain. This idea is ancient, logical, and deeply comforting. It creates a moral order in which the universe is fair and understandable. If pain has a cause, then it can be avoided. If righteousness guarantees protection, then life can be managed. Eliphaz does not say outright that Job is guilty. He does not accuse directly. Instead, he invites Job to examine himself. Perhaps there is something hidden. Perhaps there is a small failure, a quiet sin, a moral oversight. The accusation is implied, not spoken, and that makes it harder to challenge. Job is not being attacked, he is being diagnosed. Eliphaz strengthens his argument by appealing to experience. He speaks of what he has observed, what he has learned over time. Wisdom, in his view, is accumulated knowledge passed down through generations. It does not question itself, it reinforces patterns. Eliphaz trusts tradition more than testimony. He believes the system cannot be wrong, so the person must be. Then Eliphaz introduces a vision. He describes a mysterious experience in the night, a whisper that chilled him, a presence that passed before his eyes. The message of this vision is clear. No human can be more righteous than God. No one is truly pure. Even angels are flawed. This vision sounds spiritual, even profound, but its function is specific. It reduces Job's integrity to arrogance. If no one is truly righteous, then Job's claim of innocence must be self-deception. This is where comfort officially turns into accusation. Eliphaz is not trying to understand Job's pain, he is trying to defend a worldview. Job's suffering threatens the idea that the world is morally balanced, and so Eliphaz resolves the tension by shifting responsibility back onto Job. The principle here is uncomfortable but important. When people are more committed to their explanations than your experience, compassion disappears. Eliphaz believes he is helping. He believes he is guiding Job back to truth, but his words create distance instead of healing. They imply that Job's pain is not only tragic, but deserved. This chapter exposes a common human impulse. When confronted with suffering we cannot explain, we search for causes, we analyze, we categorize, we moralize. These strategies protect us from fear, because if suffering is earned, then we are safe as long as we behave correctly. Eliphaz is not cruel, he is afraid. Eliphaz's theology leaves no room for innocence in pain. In his framework, suffering is always corrective. It is either punishment or warning. There is no category for mystery. There is no space for unearned loss. And so, Job's reality becomes unacceptable. Notice how Job is positioned in this speech. He is no longer a victim of tragedy. He is a problem to be solved. His integrity becomes a liability. His questions become evidence against him. This is what happens when systems matter more than people. Chapter 4 does not end with shouting or condemnation, it ends with quiet certainty. Eliphaz is confident in his conclusions. He believes he has spoken wisdom, and this is what makes his speech so dangerous. Wrong ideas delivered calmly often cause the deepest harm. Pause and reflect. Have you ever been offered advice that felt like blame? Have you ever been told to look inward when you were already overwhelmed? Eliphaz teaches us that timing matters. Truth, when delivered without empathy, becomes violence. The call to action in this chapter is subtle but necessary. When someone is suffering, resist the urge to explain their pain. Do not rush to assign causes. Do not protect your worldview at the cost of their dignity. Sit longer, listen deeper, allow mystery to exist. Chapter 4 sets the stage for a long debate. Job's friends will continue to speak, each with confidence, each with a different angle. But they all share one assumption, that suffering must be earned. Job will challenge this belief not with arguments at first, but with lived experience. The dialogue has begun, and with it comes a question that still haunts modern life. When someone is hurting, do we offer understanding or explanations that make us feel safer?
Chapter 5. The Promise That Misses the Pain. Eliphaz continues speaking, confident that wisdom, once explained clearly enough, will resolve suffering. Chapter 5 is not a new argument, but an extension of the same belief introduced before, that pain follows rules, that suffering is meaningful because it is corrective, and that restoration is guaranteed if one submits properly. Eliphaz's tone grows warmer, almost hopeful, but this hope rests on assumptions that do not fit Job's reality. Eliphaz urges Job to appeal to God, not in protest, but in correction. He suggests that if Job accepts discipline, everything can be repaired. According to Eliphaz, God does not wound without purpose. Pain, in his view, is like medicine, bitter but healing. This idea sounds reasonable. It offers meaning. It offers structure. Most importantly, it offers closure. But it also ignores something essential. Job has already sought God, and nothing has changed. Eliphaz warns Job against anger. He frames emotional pain as a spiritual failure. To be frustrated, to question, to grieve openly, these become signs of foolishness. Eliphaz believes calm acceptance leads to healing, while emotional expression invites destruction. This belief subtly invalidates Job's experience. It suggests that how Job feels is part of the problem. He then paints a picture of the foolish person, someone who rebels against order and suffers as a result. Their life collapses, their children struggle, their security vanishes. The implication is clear, even if unstated. Job's story resembles this pattern too closely to be a coincidence. Eliphaz does not accuse directly, but his narrative leaves no room for innocence. Next, Eliphaz expands his vision of divine justice. He speaks of God as one who frustrates the plans of the crafty and lifts the humble. He describes a world where justice ultimately prevails, where the poor are protected, and where wrongdoers are exposed. This is a beautiful vision. It is also abstract. It addresses systems, not individuals. It comforts the speaker more than the sufferer. Eliphaz's speech reaches its emotional peak when he promises restoration. He tells Job that if he submits, he will be rescued from danger, protected from famine, war, and disaster. He describes a future where Job's home is peaceful, his children are secure, and his life ends in fullness and honor. These words are meant to encourage, they are meant to inspire hope, but they arrive too soon. This is the heart of the problem. Eliphaz offers hope without presence. He offers promises without listening. He skips over the reality of pain in order to arrive at a conclusion. For someone who is suffering deeply, premature hope can feel like dismissal. It suggests that pain is a temporary inconvenience rather than a lived reality. The principle of this chapter is subtle but powerful. Not all hope heals. Hope that bypasses grief often deepens it. Eliphaz believes he is lifting Job's spirit, but his words place conditions on compassion. They imply that relief must be earned through correct behavior and correct belief. Eliphaz's theology leaves no space for lament. There is no permission to sit in sorrow. There is only a path forward, mapped clearly, with rules and outcomes. But Job is not lost because he lacks direction. He is lost because his world no longer makes sense. This chapter exposes another human tendency. When faced with unresolved pain, we rush towards resolution. We want endings. We want redemption arcs. We want suffering to mean something quickly. Eliphaz's promises are attractive because they offer certainty, but certainty can be cruel when it ignores complexity. Notice how Job's voice is absent in this chapter. Eliphaz speaks uninterrupted, confident that clarity will bring comfort. But comfort cannot be forced. It must be invited. And Job is not ready to accept explanations that deny his lived experience. Reflect for a moment. Have you ever been told everything will be fine when nothing felt fine? Have you ever been offered a future when you were still drowning in the present? Eliphaz reminds us that timing matters as much as truth. The call to action here is quiet but essential. When offering hope, first acknowledge pain. Do not use promises to silence grief. Let suffering have its full voice before you rush towards resolution. Healing does not begin with answers. It begins with being seen. Chapter 5 closes with Eliphaz's final assurance that his words are true, tested, and reliable. He believes he has spoken wisdom, but wisdom without empathy becomes instruction, not comfort. Job remains unchanged, unconvinced, and unheard. The stage is now set for Job's response. He has been analyzed, corrected, and promised a future, all without being truly listened to. What comes next is not calm reflection, but a fierce defense of honesty. The debate is about to deepen, and Job's voice will no longer be restrained.
Chapter 6. When Pain Defends Itself. Job finally responds. After listening to Eliphaz's long explanations, promises, and quiet accusations, Job speaks not with rage, but with exhausted clarity. Chapter 6 is not an attack on God. It is a defense of pain itself. Job is no longer trying to explain his suffering. He is trying to make it understood. Job begins by saying something simple but profound. If his grief could be weighed, it would be heavier than the sand of the seas. This is not poetic exaggeration for effect. It is a correction. Job is telling his friends that their words feel light because they do not account for the true weight of his experience. Pain, when unseen, is always underestimated. He explains that his anguish is not imaginary, not emotional weakness, not exaggeration. It is overwhelming. It presses into his body and his spirit. Job believes that the arrows of God are in him, not as punishment, but as reality. He feels targeted, overwhelmed, and depleted. His suffering has crossed the threshold from endurance into despair. Job challenges his friend's lack of empathy through imagery. He compares himself to a wild donkey or an ox, animals that cry out only when they lack food or comfort. His point is direct. Pain has a cause. Cries do not come from nothing. If he is speaking like this, it is because something is deeply wrong. Silence was possible before. Now it is not. Then Job turns the lens toward his friends. He accuses them of being unreliable, like seasonal streams that promise water but dry up when needed most. From a distance, they appear helpful, but in the moment of crisis, they fail. This metaphor cuts deep because it names a familiar disappointment. Support that exists in theory but disappears in reality is often more painful than open hostility. Job tells them plainly that he did not ask for wealth, rescue, or protection. He did not demand solutions. He asked only for understanding. He wanted honesty, not correction, presence, not theology. Instead, his friends offered fear disguised as wisdom. This is a turning point. Job asserts that truth matters more than comfort. If he is wrong, he wants to be shown where, not accused vaguely, not implied, but demonstrated clearly. He invites correction, but only if it is rooted in reality rather than assumption. His integrity is not fragile, it is precise. The principle of this chapter is powerful. Pain deserves proportion. When suffering is extreme, responses must be careful. Simplistic answers do not scale to deep wounds. Job is not rejecting wisdom, he is rejecting wisdom that refuses to engage with lived experience. Job goes further. He confronts the moral framework his friends rely on. He suggests that their certainty comes from distance, not insight. They are comfortable because they are not suffering, and comfort, when unexamined, creates blindness. This is not an insult, it is an observation. Then Job exposes the cruelty hidden inside moral certainty. When people believe suffering must be deserved, compassion becomes conditional. Help is offered only if the sufferer admits guilt. Innocence becomes irrelevant. Job refuses this trade. He will not confess to crimes he did not commit just to receive sympathy. Job also speaks about speech itself. He argues that words spoken in despair should not be judged as carefully as words spoken in peace. Pain distorts language. Suffering sharpens emotion. To demand perfect speech from a broken person is to misunderstand humanity. This chapter reminds us that tone matters. Job is not calm, but he is not irrational. His words are structured, intentional, and measured. He is not lashing out randomly. He is pushing back against misrepresentation. Pain, when unheard, will eventually defend itself. Pause and reflect. Have you ever had to explain your pain to someone who had already decided what it meant? Have you ever felt judged for how you expressed grief rather than understood for why it existed? Job gives voice to that frustration without apology. The call to action here is simple but demanding. When someone tells you they are hurting, believe them. Do not minimize. Do not measure their pain against your expectations. Let their experience define its own weight. Chapter 6 ends without reconciliation. Job's friends are challenged but not convinced. The tension remains unresolved. Understanding has not been reached, but something important has happened. Job has reclaimed his narrative. He has refused to let others define his suffering for him. The dialogue has shifted. No longer is Job only the subject of explanation. He is now an active participant in the search for meaning. And his next words will press even closer to the edge of despair, where questions about God himself can no longer be avoided.
Chapter 7. The Hardship of Existence. Job's words deepen in chapter 7, moving from the immediate anguish of loss and illness to the broader, universal weight of human existence. He no longer speaks simply of personal pain or misunderstanding from friends. Now he reflects on life itself, its brevity, its fragility, and the seeming futility of labor and survival. This chapter is a meditation on mortality, suffering, and the search for meaning when the familiar frameworks of fairness and justice fail. Job begins by describing human life in vivid, unflinching language. Is there not a time for man on earth? Are not his days few? He portrays life as fleeting, fragile, and laborious, emphasizing the relentless toil that defines existence. Sleep offers only temporary reprieve. Work is exhausting. Even joy is fleeting, disappearing quickly like morning dew under the heat of the sun. Job's words convey exhaustion at the very rhythm of life, a fatigue that extends beyond his own illness or loss.
Then he turns to God, questioning why life must be so harsh. Job is not questioning God's existence or power. He is questioning the structure of human experience under divine sovereignty. Remember that my life is but a breath. My eye will never again see joy. These statements reveal Job's profound awareness of the tension between human vulnerability and divine authority. He does not reject God. He wrestles with the reality of living under a system that seems unyielding. Job further explores the emotional weight of human suffering. He describes his days as swifter than a weaver's shuttle, emphasizing the brevity and inevitability of life's progression. Time moves forward relentlessly, and there is little opportunity to pause, understand, or recover. This imagery suggests that human beings are at once active participants in life and helpless observers of its passing, caught between choice and circumstance. He laments the seeming injustice of labor and hardship. A person labors all day, enduring exhaustion, only to find no lasting satisfaction or recognition. Children grow up and leave, friends fail to understand, and death eventually comes to all. Job's reflection is universal. All human beings are subject to forces beyond their control, and most of life consists of enduring the inescapable. Job's speech also touches on isolation. He describes feeling abandoned by friends and family, ignored or misunderstood, and left to confront both physical pain and existential dread alone. This solitude amplifies his suffering. When anguish is both internal and socially not recognized, it intensifies. Job's friends have spoken, but their words have not comforted him. They have compounded his isolation. Importantly, Job's chapter balances despair with honesty. He is not angry for the sake of rebellion. He is not bitter in a performative way. He is expressing truth as he experiences it, acknowledging the emotional, spiritual, and physical dimensions of human suffering. In doing so, he provides a language for readers who have experienced similar pain, showing that despair is not weakness, but human honesty. This chapter also introduces a subtle reflection on hope and resignation. While Job questions God and the nature of life, he does not call for destruction or abandon his faith. His suffering is profound, but he remains in dialogue with God. The struggle is not whether God exists, but whether human suffering can be reconciled with divine purpose. This tension is central to the book of Job. Faith is tested not by absence of pain, but by persistence through it. The principle of chapter 7 is clear. Life is brief, laborious, and uncertain, and suffering is universal. Yet the human response, honest reflection, questioning, and articulation of anguish is itself a form of courage. Job's willingness to name the hardship of existence demonstrates that the first step towards meaning is acknowledgement, not resolution. The call to action is reflective. Readers and listeners are encouraged to sit with the reality of human limitation, recognize the brevity and fragility of life, accept that suffering is part of existence, speak honestly about your own experience, and listen attentively to the sufferings of others, without rushing to explanation, justification, or comfort. Chapter 7 closes without offering solutions or comfort. Job's voice is raw and vulnerable, yet clear and articulate. The stage is now set for further confrontation with his friend's rigid theology, with the deeper questions of justice, and with the ultimate challenge of reconciling human suffering with divine authority. Job has named the weight of existence. The next chapters will explore not only the injustice of suffering, but also the search for meaning in the midst of it.
Chapter 8. The Confidence of Tradition. After Job speaks in chapter 7, expressing the raw weight of existence and the pain of life itself, Bildad the Shuhite rises to respond. Chapter 8 introduces a stark contrast to Job's honesty. It is the voice of tradition, of moral certainty, and of comforting assumptions. Unlike Eliphaz, whose words were tentative and cautious, Bildad speaks with blunt confidence. His speech reveals the danger of rigid belief when it encounters human suffering. Bildad begins by affirming the justice of God. In his worldview, the world is orderly, the wicked are punished, the righteous are rewarded, and suffering is almost always deserved. He addresses Job with the assumption that his anguish must have a cause. If Job is suffering, Bildad implies, then Job must have erred. Innocent suffering in Bildad's framework is almost unthinkable. This assumption is not cruel. It is conventional. It is the lens through which society has long understood misfortune. But it is also profoundly limited. Bildad's argument proceeds in 3 steps. First, he reminds Job of the brevity of human life and the impossibility of matching God's wisdom. Does God pervert judgment? He asks. According to Bildad, no. Every trial, every misfortune is proportional and justified. By framing his argument with certainty, Bildad makes Job's pain feel like a moral failing rather than an existential mystery. What Bildad intends as reassurance, however, lands as accusation. Second, Bildad uses historical examples to reinforce his point. He speaks of past generations, of families destroyed because of their sins, of cities leveled by divine judgment. He implies that Job should examine himself, repent, and acknowledge wrongdoing. History, in his eyes, is proof that God's justice is unwavering. Bildad's confidence rests on precedent. Suffering always has a reason, always fits a pattern. This approach comforts those who observe suffering from a distance, but can deepen the isolation of the one enduring it. Next, Bildad emphasizes brevity and the fleeting nature of human life, framing them as incentives for moral correction. Consider now, who that forgets God prospers, he asks. In other words, suffering is corrective. It is a warning, a guide, a teacher. Bildad presents this as hope, but it is conditional. Relief comes only if Job admits guilt, repents, and conforms. The comfort offered is contingent upon Job's self-condemnation. Here again, tradition overshadows empathy. Throughout his speech, Bildad is direct, even harsh, but he believes he is speaking truth. He sees Job's honesty as foolishness. He perceives Job's despair as arrogance. To Bildad, anyone questioning divine justice or the moral order is not exploring truth, they are rebelling against it. This perspective makes him confident, but it blinds him to the uniqueness of Job's situation. Suffering in Bildad's framework must fit a template. Individual experience is irrelevant. The principle of chapter 8 is instructive. Rigid frameworks can misinterpret suffering as guilt. When we prioritize rules, precedents, or moral systems over human experience, we risk causing more harm than comfort. Bildad embodies the human tendency to seek order and fairness by explaining away chaos, even at the expense of truth. His certainty is appealing from a distance, but fails to engage with the lived reality of agony. Job, listening to Bildad, is positioned at the intersection of despair and misunderstanding. His pain has been met with explanation rather than compassion. His honesty, already difficult for friends to hear, is now judged against conventional wisdom. Bildad's confidence highlights a critical tension in the narrative between the moral frameworks we inherit and the messy, unpredictable nature of human life. Suffering is not always ordered. Life does not always obey precedent. In response, Job will need to reconcile his personal experience with these assumptions.
He has endured loss, physical pain, and misunderstanding from friends who believe in simple moral equations. Chapter 8 forces him and the reader to confront the inadequacy of tradition when applied unthinkingly to human anguish. Here lies one of the Book of Job's central lessons. Real suffering cannot be simplified into rules or histories. It demands presence, patience, and reflection. Pause for reflection. How often do we apply conventional explanations to the suffering of others? How frequently do we assume someone must be guilty, unwise, or flawed because their life does not fit our expectations? Bildad's speech reminds us to question the comfort of certainty and to honor the complexity of lived experience. The call to action is subtle but essential. Before offering advice, examine whether your understanding serves the person in pain or protects your worldview. Compassion requires listening first, explanation comes later. Ensure that support is unconditional and avoid the trap of moralizing suffering. Chapter 8 closes with the tension intact. Bildad has spoken with confidence, history, and tradition, but Job's voice remains unbroken. He has yet to yield. The stage is set for Job's next response, which will defend both his integrity and the raw reality of human suffering against friends who speak certainty but not empathy.
Chapter 9. The Challenge of Justice. Job responds in Chapter 9 with a voice that balances frustration, honesty, and profound reflection. Unlike his earlier speeches, which focused on personal grief, Chapter 9 moves toward the larger question of divine justice and human limitation. Job no longer only defends his suffering, he confronts the seeming impossibility of contending with God, the gap between human understanding and divine authority, and the weight of justice when it appears distant or inscrutable. Job begins by acknowledging God's power. He observes that the Creator is beyond human reckoning. Truly, I know that it is so, but how can a mortal be righteous before God? This statement sets the tone of the chapter. Job recognizes the vastness of divine authority, yet his acknowledgement is not submission. It is a reflection on the inherent tension between human frailty and divine omnipotence. The question Job raises is timeless. How can imperfect humans ever satisfy a perfect, unseen standard? He illustrates the disparity with vivid metaphors. God, he says, is like a tempest or a flood, inescapable, overwhelming, and uncontrollable. Humans are like fragile vessels, tossed and broken by forces beyond their comprehension. Job understands that morality, integrity, and innocence have limits in the face of cosmic power. Even his righteousness feels fragile, almost irrelevant when weighed against the scale of divine sovereignty. Job reflects on the difficulty of arguing one's case before God. He compares it to presenting a legal case before a judge who is infinitely wise, infinitely powerful, and beyond persuasion. Every argument is inadequate. Every justification feels insufficient. Job realizes that he cannot compel God to explain, cannot demand fairness in human terms, and cannot negotiate relief through clever reasoning. This is the first acknowledgement of the gap between justice as humans understand it and justice as God administers it. Yet Job does not despair entirely. He continues to speak truthfully about his innocence. He asserts that he has acted with integrity and avoided wrongdoing. He does not claim perfection. He recognizes human fallibility, but he maintains that his suffering is not proportional to any fault he may have committed. This insistence on his integrity is central. Job is not merely lamenting. He is insisting that morality exists even when punishment seems arbitrary. He also contrasts human helplessness with God's omnipotence. No one can question divine authority successfully, he says. Even the most righteous cannot answer God fully or stand justified without humility.
Job knows that life and death, blessing and curse, rise and fall belong ultimately to God's domain. Humans can observe patterns, enforce social rules, and act morally within communities, but these frameworks do not dictate divine judgment. This reflection underscores the vulnerability inherent in existence. Humans act within a system they cannot control, and suffering often defies explanation. Chapter 9 also examines Job's personal frustration with justice. He wonders why calamity strikes the innocent and the guilty alike. Why are the righteous afflicted while the wicked prosper? He paints images of the powerful prevailing over the weak, wealth accumulating for the selfish, and life's randomness creating chaos. Job does not reach easy answers. Instead, he acknowledges that the complexity of the universe may never align with human ideas of fairness. He further explores the idea of divine mystery. Even if he were to argue his case, Job recognizes that God's understanding surpasses human logic. God measures the heavens, shapes the earth, and governs the winds and seas. To contend with such authority is impossible. Job sees the futility of trying to rationalize cosmic justice on human terms. Yet this futility does not silence him. It sharpens his awareness that suffering and morality exist together, even when coherence is absent. Job also contemplates intercession. He wonders if there is a mediator, someone who can bridge the gap between human frailty and divine judgment. Without such a figure, he feels trapped in the tension between innocence and suffering. The desire for an advocate reflects a deep yearning for connection, for relief, and for comprehension, something to translate human pain into terms the cosmos can acknowledge. The principle of chapter 9 is clear. The struggle for justice is both internal and external. Humans can act rightly, speak truthfully, and maintain integrity, yet still face circumstances beyond control. Justice, as humans perceive it, may never perfectly align with the events of life. Job's reflections challenge readers to recognize both the limits of human understanding and the moral significance of integrity in the midst of incomprehensible suffering. Pause and reflect. How often do we demand fairness when life does not provide it? How often do we measure suffering against our own sense of justice rather than accept the reality of forces beyond our control? Job teaches that acknowledgement, honesty, and persistence are forms of courage even when resolution is impossible. The call to action is subtle but profound. Maintain integrity even when justice seems absent. Speak truth even when it is not heard. Recognize your limitations while continuing to act morally and conscientiously. The value lies in not guaranteed outcomes, but in faithful participation in life's moral challenges. Chapter 9 ends with tension intact. Job's voice is firm, questioning, and aware of human limitations. He has not reconciled his suffering with divine justice, but he has articulated the struggle in a way that is both personal and universal. The dialogue with his friends and with God continues, now with a deeper focus on the intersection of morality, suffering, and the unknowable nature of divine authority.
Chapter 10. The Accusation of Existence. In chapter 10, Job's lament deepens from questioning divine justice to confronting the Creator directly. His voice grows more intimate, more urgent, and more personal. Whereas chapter 9 explored the impossibility of contending with God's power and the vastness of divine authority, chapter 10 focuses on the anguish of being created, the frustration of existence, and the struggle to reconcile life's pain with the one who made it. Here, Job's reflections move from philosophical contemplation to raw dialogue with God. Job begins by addressing God directly, speaking as a child might to a parent whose actions are incomprehensible yet unavoidable. "I loathe my life. I would not live forever. Let me alone," he cries.
These words are not rebellion in the abstract, they are an expression of unbearable suffering. Job is not questioning God's existence, nor is he denying divine authority. He is questioning the reason for his creation, the circumstances into which he was brought, and the suffering he must endure. He then recounts his own formation, reflecting on the process of being made. "Did you not pour me out like milk and curd me like cheese?" he asks, describing creation as an intimate, deliberate act. Job's language emphasizes both care and control. God is portrayed as one who shapes, molds, and animates life with precision. Yet that intimacy now feels oppressive. The same hands that formed him are the ones permitting pain and loss. Job is caught between reverence and frustration, a tension that mirrors the human experience of suffering at the hands of forces we cannot influence. Job questions the purpose of life itself. He wonders aloud why existence was granted only to endure misery, to toil without satisfaction, and to suffer with no clear end. "Did you not bring me forth from the womb? Would that I had perished." This is not a rejection of God's sovereignty, but an accusation against the consequences of being made mortal. Life, he asserts, has become unbearable. His lament highlights the paradox of creation. To be alive is to experience both beauty and pain, but when pain overwhelms, existence itself seems like injustice. He wrestles with the seeming arbitrariness of suffering. Job recalls the blessings he once had, security, family, prosperity, and contrasts them with the devastation he now experiences. This juxtaposition magnifies his grief, making the current reality feel almost surreal. Why grant life if it will be filled with such profound loss? Why create, knowing that suffering will inevitably follow? These questions strike at the core of theological inquiry, theodicy, or the reconciliation of divine goodness with human suffering. Job also expresses deep frustration with the idea that his misery might serve a purpose beyond his understanding. He is aware of theological arguments that portray suffering as corrective, instructive, or redemptive. Yet for Job, the experience is immediate, overwhelming, and often senseless. He cannot see the lesson, he can only feel the reality. In doing so, Job captures the human tension between faith and lived experience, the moment when abstract explanations fall short of comforting the wounded soul. In the midst of his lament, Job acknowledges God's authority while simultaneously asserting the legitimacy of his anguish. He does not curse God's existence, he curses the consequences of creation. This subtle distinction is crucial. Job's speech is not rebellion for its own sake, it is honesty. He refuses to disguise his pain under platitudes, moralistic reasoning, or forced gratitude. In this, he models a form of courage that is rarely celebrated, the courage to speak truth to power while remaining aware of that power's magnitude. The chapter also emphasizes Job's search for reciprocity. He longs for dialogue, for acknowledgement, for answers. The absence of response from God heightens his sense of isolation. He is both intimate with the Creator, knowing himself as God's work, and alienated from the one who could offer relief or explanation. This tension between proximity and distance deepens the emotional resonance of Job's words, portraying suffering as both personal and cosmic. The principle of chapter 10 is profound. Existence itself can be a source of both wonder and torment. Creation grants life, but life inevitably brings suffering. Job's lament shows that it is natural to question the wisdom behind existence, to confront the discomfort and frustration of mortality, and to speak openly about these conflicts without feeling guilt or shame. Pain is not only physical or social, it is existential, and it demands acknowledgement. Pause and reflect. Have you ever felt the weight of existence itself pressing down? Have you questioned why life was given in the first place when circumstances make survival feel impossible? Job teaches that such questions are not signs of weakness, they are evidence of depth, reflection, and engagement with the most profound aspects of life. The call to action in this chapter is subtle. Allow yourself to confront the reality of your existence honestly. Speak your questions, your anguish, and your frustration without fear of judgment. Seek understanding where you can, but recognize that some questions may remain unanswered. Courage is found not in certainty, but in the willingness to inhabit life fully, even when it is painful and perplexing. Chapter 10 closes with Job still in dialogue, still questioning, and still vulnerable. The tension between human suffering and divine authority remains unresolved. But Job's honesty has strengthened the narrative. Pain has a voice, existence can be questioned, and the human spirit retains dignity even when the cosmos feels indifferent. The stage is now prepared for the deeper theological and philosophical debates that will follow in the coming chapters, as Job's friends continue to speak and Job's struggle for understanding intensifies. I can continue with chapter 11, around 1,500 words next, in the same detailed, reflective, no-gap style, keeping the momentum consistent. Do you want me to proceed?